Welcome to the podcast Shedding Candlelight on Cryptids, Hauntings, Mythology, and more. If it is weird, we are talking about it. This is your host, LeeDawna, and today's hauntingly good tale is one of love, murder, and tickles. That's right, good, clean, plain old-fashioned tickling, which forces me to give you this bit of scientific fact. Being tickled is a painful experience. The part where people laugh is only a reflex. Look it up, and then all of you ticklers out there, be ashamed of yourselves. No excuses. You can't decide that you are just a fun-loving ghost, and so therefore it is okay to torture the living. Nope, no tickling is ever okay under any circumstances. There is a whole true crime case based around tickling, and it is super horrible. So I probably will not ever cover that one on this show. But we are going to dive into a different kind of horrible case today. So let's begin to wind our way through this sordid tale, because if you are a fan of true crime, as I myself am, then this tale is right up your alley. It subjectively starts on June the 2nd of 1829 when a boy named David Rose was born. If you are a fan of Schitt's Creek on Netflix, you will recognize this name. Sadly, though, our David Rose is nothing like the character on the show, and his life was all the worse for it. Our little David Rose, his great-grandfather, was a German immigrant who settled in upstate New York. David's father, whose name was Lawrence, moved his family from New York to southern Ohio after the family patriarch died. It was there in 1829, southern Ohio, that David was born. And as he grew up, he learned about grist mills and he became a miller like his father. The mills David worked in were those perched over swift-moving streams where the water was harnessed to turn big, heavy grinding stones that crushed grain into flour. Then the grain, at whatever coarseness it was ground to, was bagged and sent back out to be sold or taken home to be used for the baking and such. On February the 8th of 1855, when David was 26 years old, he married the love of his life, 21-year-old Rebecca Easter. After they were married, the two moved to Pike County, Ohio, east of Sinking Spring, where they ended up on an 80-acre property, 7 acres of which they cleared and used as their homestead. One short year later, in 1856, Rebecca gave birth to the couple's first child. His name was John, but he unfortunately did not live to see his first birthday. The following year, on December the 1st, 1857, the couple welcomed their second child, another son whose name was Walter. This child was sickly, and many believed that he would not survive either, but against all odds, little Walter did live. He had some developmental challenges, with people later saying he was not very bright. But though Walter never married or left his parents' home, he did work and he had some responsibilities at home and around town. His father, David, was known to have a short fuse, and it seems that Walter inherited this temper. He was known to be difficult and hot-headed. Townsfolk knew not to cross Walter or David. But as will become a theme later on, no one had too high of an opinion of anyone in the Rose family, but they thought that the dim-witted Rose clan was perfectly harmless. In 1859, when Walter was less than 2 years old, his first sister was born. Her name was Julia, and 2 years after her birth, on September the 8th of 1861, David left his wife and 2 children to join the Union Army fighting in the Civil War. Less than a year after that, on July 23rd, 1862, David deserted his post. He did, however, and I guess to his credit, return to his Army duty station, only to desert again on April the 17th of 1863. This time, he went back to the Army on April the 30th. Then on October 31st, while his regiment was in Memphis, Tennessee, David's military record shows him marked as being sick in his quarters. This Halloween day of 1863 begins what I am sure David would have referred to at that time as the worst period of his life. Today, the sickness that befell him would probably be categorized as irritable bowel syndrome. All the records indicate that the man just could not stay out of the bathroom. He had severe bouts of diarrhea, and by May of 1864, his ailment was so bad that he was hospitalized. This episode of his chronic diarrhea lasted more or less the entire months of May and June, with David being transferred to different hospitals before being released to return to the Army on June the 30th of 1864. On August the 3rd of 1864, David was allowed to go home to visit his family. But after he returned from his furlough, he deserted his post once again on November the 30th of 1864. This time, David did not go back. Now, most of what I've heard and read about the fate of deserters is not good. They are usually hunted down, and back in those days, they were often killed upon capture. The lucky ones got locked up. Somehow, David avoided both of those fates. He found favor or sympathy with someone in the Army because they not only kept taking him back each time he ran off, but after he deserted this last time, the Army gave him a New Year's gift, issuing David an honorable discharge in January of 1865. A little over 8 years later, on March the 13th, 1873, David and Rebecca welcomed their second daughter and fourth child into the world. Her name was Ceely Rose. Much like her brother Walter, Ceely was described in many unflattering ways. Ceely very clearly had some mental maladies, and people would say that the giggly girl was not quite right in the head, that she wasn't all there upstairs. But daft as she was not a menace or a threat. However, there were those who described Ceely as being a monstrous and vile young woman. She had some fits of anger, which, with her father and older brother being hot-tempered, it's no surprise that Ceely would have picked up some of that behavior. It's said that she once got mad and slapped a small child. So maybe this dark side of her personality that only showed itself on occasion is why certain people called her a degenerate. Today, she's even been labeled as a psychopath. Author Mark Sebastian Jordan, who wrote a book about this case for the History Press titled The Ceely Rose Murders at Malabar Farm, said he thinks Ceely is a fascinating mix of all of these things, that the events of her life occurred as a circumstance of not only her nature, but of the nurture she received from her family and the community. As we move through these events, you can decide for yourself if you think Ceely simply had a troubled mind and that she did not know the difference between right and wrong, or if you think her dastardly deeds prove Ceely Rose had a heart full of hatred and a mind for cold-blooded murder. When Ceely was 6 years old, about 14 years after David's honorable discharge from the Army, the Rose family sold their 80-acre farm to their first daughter, Julia's new husband. Then there is some back and forth in the records with the property being sold back to the mom, Rebecca, the deed suddenly devoid of her husband's name. The same thing occurred in 1880 when Rebecca purchased a 2-acre property that was deeded solely in her name. This would have been a rare thing back in those days when absolutely everything was just in the husband's name. But by all accounts, Rebecca was a strong-willed woman, willing to do whatever it took to keep her family afloat. She was the backbone of the Rose family. Maybe this is why she decided to move her family to give them more opportunities. The 2-acre property that Rebecca purchased was in a community nestled within the heart of Ohio's farmland, tucked among the beautiful and peaceful hills of Richland County in a place called Pleasant Valley. Their new land contained a simple two-story house with the upper floor where the sleeping quarters were only accessible via a ladder. A creek ran along the back of the property, and over top of this swift moving creek was an old water powered grist mill. The family lived in the farmhouse while David returned to his original line of work. Unfortunately, though, at this point in history, gasoline powered threshers were putting these old water powered grist mills out of business. This is probably why Rebecca was able to purchase the property for a fairly low price. It's also probably the reason David was able to return to his line of work. You see, his health was still poor. Shortly after the family moved to Pleasant Valley, David filed for disability, with many doctors and witnesses testifying on his behalf, all of them verifying that David had sustained injuries during the Civil War that had stayed with him and affected his ability to work for all of the years since his spotty military service. David was blind in one eye, fully deaf in his right ear, and partially deaf in his left ear. On top of all of that, he still had those debilitating bouts of chronic diarrhea. Independently, any one of these issues could make it hard for David to work. With all of them piling up against him, David and Rebecca might have thought that owning their own mill would give David the freedom to work only during the hours and days when his health allowed him to, especially with the type of mill he bought being outdated and therefore not in high demand with the local farmers. David filled smaller orders for his neighbors, milling their grain as his health and time allowed. Luckily for him, because of his honorable discharge, he was also granted a disability payment of a whopping $12 a month. With this little income, Rebecca helped support her family by weaving and selling rugs. Walter, being an adult by this time, also helped out because, unlike Julia, who had gotten married and stayed behind with her husband, Walter was still living with his parents. He worked when he could, being a day laborer at neighboring farms. He also tended to the pigs that the Rose family raised for food. The family also kept a vegetable and herb garden on their small 2-acre property, and they had a spring that provided them with fresh, clean water. The spring had a structure atop it called the spring house, and the spring also fed a small pond that was nearby. In the woods behind the house, there was a playhouse where Ceely would go to play. She did this into her early 20s, giving us a little more of a clue about her mental standing, especially when we factor in the times that Ceely mentioned wanting to be the lady in charge. So she might have considered this little playhouse her sanctuary, the place where she could be in charge and do things her way. Many people seem to have witnessed Ceely in her playhouse throwing things around. When they asked what she was doing, she told them she was cooking. In 1896, Ceely was 23 years old, and she'd been living in Pleasant Valley for a little over 16 years. During this time, the people in her rural farming community didn't seem to pay her too much mind. In fact, the entire Rose family wasn't paid too much mind. Folks were friendly with them, and some people were even friends with them, but overall, the family was considered ill-educated and backwards. Ceely attended the one-room schoolhouse that educated children in the valley, but she never really advanced much. At the age of 20, one of her teachers said Ceely was more at the level of the 6 to 10-year-olds. Ceely could read, write, and do basic math, but she did not have a mind for higher learning. So Ceely stayed at a lower level of educational understanding while others her age finished their courses and no doubt went off to get married and start families of their own. I am sure that Ceely had some personal feelings about growing up and watching others advance while she remained the same, even if it was just a biologically hormonal thing that she didn't really understand enough to know why she was feeling certain ways. But though some people did call her a troublemaking degenerate, it doesn't appear that any of them ever saw any severe behaviors that would indicate to them that Ceely was well and truly dangerous. It seemed as if they were more just annoyed with her giggly, 2 shades shy of a crayon box, childlike demeanor. None of them more so than the Barry family, who lived in a house atop the hill above the mill. The Barry family's front porch faced the mill, and the road that passed their house led down to the backside of the mill. The families could stand in their yards and easily have a conversation. This meant the Barrys probably heard many of the outbursts happening inside the Rose home, and it was this close proximity to the Rose family that gave the Barrys a familiarity with their neighbors that they would have preferred not to have. David Rose, being mean natured by many accounts, was not someone George Barry wanted around his family. They did not speak or wave to one another and remained merely civil in public when forced to be around each other. Unfortunately for the Barry family, Ceely became infatuated with their 16-year-old son, Guy. This came after she had written love letters to two more age-appropriate men, with one of them politely thanking her and then never bringing the letter up again, while the other laughed in her face and taunted her about it afterward. As for Guy Barry, some accounts say that he teased Ceely, sort of egged her on when it came to her infatuation with him. I can easily see a 16-year-old boy doing that. However, regardless of his actions, he was a child. There are too many cases out there where people cheat on their partners and then someone ends up dead, or where these real true life narcissistic psychopaths manipulate the people around them to think that someone is into them or doing something untoward. And then the person or people being manipulated then commit murder on behalf of the narcissist. There are certainly cases where at 16 years old, a person should rightfully be tried as an adult for the crimes they commit. However, in this case, because of the lack of knowing the extent to which Guy did or did not egg on Ceely's infatuation with him, I don't think that we can place any blame on Guy. He could have simply been a nice kid who talked to Ceely because no one else would. He could have felt bad for her and had enough empathy to be her friend. It could be the other way around, and Guy could have been preying on her, finding humor in her affection for him, or worse. But absent any actual evidence of him being despicable, I'm going to give the kid a pass. You don't have to. I was definitely side-eyeing Guy Barry at first, so I understand where you're coming from. But either way, I think that we should use Guy's relationship with Ceely as a cautionary tale. If you are in a situation where you can see that someone is into you more than you're into them, and especially if you see their interest in you growing into something more, end that relationship or set very clear boundaries where you are not sugarcoating the rejection and making excuses for not liking the other person the way that they want you to. We get ourselves into trouble trying to be nice, which is a lesson I learned the hard way. So let's all just learn to stop being nice in situations where being clear and direct will benefit everyone. Of course, this advice only applies if you are a decent human. If you get a kick out of manipulating people, then I can only say that I hope karma swings back your way real soon, because nothing delivers justice the way karma does. As for Ceely, in 1896, she is a 23-year-old woman who decides that she is fully and truly in love with 16-year-old Guy Barry. So much so that she started telling everyone in town that she and Guy were going to be married. She even told Guy that they were going to be married in 3 years, and that if he did not marry her, he would regret it because she would go off and marry one of the other three boys in town who were all trying to kiss her. Whether these other three boys existed or not, Guy, for the most part, didn't really seem to care. His dad did, though. Mr. Barry was enraged over the fact that Ceely was always at their house bothering Guy or following his eldest son all over town. And he was especially angry that Ceely was telling everyone that after she married Guy, she would be the Mrs. Barry and the mother in her very own household. Guy, being the eldest son, had certain responsibilities imparted on him by his family, and one of those would have been an expectation that he would marry well. No one in the Rose family was considered well, so on June 4th, 1896, Mr. Barry marched himself to the mill and demanded that David Rose get his daughter under control. George Barry wanted Ceely to stop spreading these outlandish rumors of marriage, and he wanted her to be kept off of his property and away from all of his sons, because apparently Ceely told Guy's 10-year-old brother that if Guy didn't marry her, she was going to marry him, the 10-year-old, who protested because he was too young. But Ceely simply said that she could wait until he was of marrying age, and then she would have him. David Rose told George Barry that he would take care of the Ceely situation, and in short order, David unleashed his famous temper on his daughter, forbidding her to even speak Guy's name ever again. Ceely was devastated and tried to argue, but both of her parents shut her down. They had heard and seen enough out of her, and they ordered Ceely not to even look out the window where she used to sit and watch Guy Barry coming and going. Ceely was furious, but she decided to keep that fury hidden. Instead, she went the opposite route and started being overly pleasant around the house. She was tending to her chores like never before and keeping her mouth entirely shut when it came to her unyielding love for the young, handsome, and well-to-do Guy Barry. On June 24th of 1896, Ceely went out to the spring house before heading back into the kitchen to help her mother prepare breakfast for the family. Her mom made eggs to serve with some slices of bread, while Ceely prepared bowls of cottage cheese. She mixed in canned cherries, stirred it all up, and stood aside as her family sat down to eat. Her father, David, ate one whole plate and fixed himself another. Her brother, Walter, had one full plate, while her mother, Rebecca, had a headache, so she only ate a little bit. Ceely herself didn't eat anything at all. She did not even drink any of the coffee she had prepared to go along with the food. After breakfast, David headed off to the mill while Walter grabbed a bucket and set out in search of some black raspberries that were ripening along the edge of the woods. Rebecca was about to go start a new rug when she suddenly came down with an intense thirst. She asked Ceely to get her a glass of water, and being a dutiful daughter, Ceely fetched her mother the water. As soon as Rebecca gulped the liquid down, she became violently ill, retching all over the place before collapsing onto the kitchen floor. It was such a sudden and explosive outburst that Ceely laughed. Her mom was on the floor trying to get up, but Rebecca was having one convulsion after another. She couldn't stop throwing up. So she managed to yell out, telling Ceely to stop laughing and go get her father from the mill. Ceely did as instructed, racing to the mill and telling her father that her mother was puking all over the place. David raced back to the house and helped his wife into a chair. By this time, her stomach was completely empty, but she was still dry heaving, and the pain in her stomach was extreme. Rebecca was also still thirsty. David gave her water, but it immediately came right back up. Whatever was happening to Rebecca was serious, so David hitched the horse to his buggy and set out to get the doctor. Now, the town's normal doctor was away for the week, so David had to go a little further in order to fetch Dr. John McComb. David told the doctor what was happening, and the man made haste, gathering his things and hopping into David's waiting buggy. However, during the trip, David found himself growing extremely thirsty. It was so intense that he decided to stop off at a farmhouse to beg for a glass of water. The family in the home gladly provided David Rose with water, but as soon as he finished drinking it, he collapsed onto the floor in pain and started vomiting. The doctor, still needing to check on David's wife and now being more concerned about her since David is having the exact same symptoms as his wife, this forced Dr. McComb to haul David out of the farmhouse and back into the buggy, taking the reins himself and racing for the Rose home as fast as he could. When the doctor arrived, he had Ceely help him to get her father into the house. He put David on the couch, but before he could further check on David or Rebecca, a neighbor came pounding on the front door. They had just found Walter collapsed in a ditch and were bringing him home because Ceely's older brother was experiencing the same pain and vomiting as his parents. The doctor took Walter into a back room of the house and attempted to make him comfortable before looking around at this horribly ill family. They were all convulsing, crying out in pain and vomiting, all of them except for one. Dr. McComb turned to where Ceely stood. Her eyes were wide, not in horror, but in fascination. There was some form of satisfaction in what the doctor was seeing, and that's when he knew, without a doubt, that this family did not have food poisoning. He'd been trained in the effects of poison and knew right then and there that Ceely had intentionally poisoned her entire family. After writhing in pain and slipping in and out of consciousness for 6 whole days, David Rose died on June the 30th. Rebecca, still suffering, though not as severely as her husband and son, was not told about David's death. The doctors and gathered neighbors feared the news would weaken her resolve to live, and at the time, she was the only one of the original three showing any signs of recovery. Walter was wasting away, his lips dry and cracked as he slowly died of dehydration, unable to keep any liquid or solid food in his stomach. On July 4th, he followed his father into the afterlife. By the time of Walter's death, this case was already being looked at as a murder by way of poisoning. The problem for the prosecution was twofold. First, if Ceely did in fact poison her family, her mental capacity would be called into question, and basically to intentionally poison someone, you would have had to have planned the deed, which meant Ceely would be charged with first-degree murder, a conviction the prosecution did not think that they could secure when they factored in Ceely's mental capacity. The second problem was that Ceely's mother, Rebecca, even while weak and barely clinging to life, refused to implicate her daughter. Guys, I'm going to take a little break. I'm sorry, my throat. I'm trying to cough, do cough drops, all the things, and it's just not working. So I apologize that I'm crackly. You guys are probably used to it by now. Every time I record, something crazy internal happens to me. And this is the voice that I have. Okay, so Rebecca coached Ceely on how to answer any questions that were asked of her and adamantly denied that Ceely had any part in preparing the family's breakfast that fateful June morning. Rebecca claimed that she and she alone prepared the entire meal. And when Ceely was asked, she would look to her mother and answer the question exactly as her mother had. In the third week of July, Rebecca was recovering. The doctor told her the progress would be slow, but that she was past the worst of it and was certain to survive. Ceely was present and overheard this happy news and eagerly fulfilled her mother's request when Rebecca said that she was finally well enough to eat some solid food. What she ate wasn't much, but Rebecca had milk and bread. I think author Mark Sebastian Jordan had it right when he said this meal was probably cornbread steeped in milk, because that is a popular thing in Appalachia and what my own family used to eat. But no matter what the exact bread was, Ceely went to the cool spring house where they kept the milk and fixed her mother a bowl of food. Rebecca liked it so much that she asked Ceely for another bowl. Ceely, who was living her best life, being in control of the household and cooking up a storm, promptly ran out to the spring house, fetched the milk, and prepared another bowl. Rebecca dug into the food, but after a few bites, she stopped, commenting that the milk tasted a little funny, that it tasted different than it did in the first bowl she'd eaten. Ceely told her it was the exact same milk, so she didn't really know what the problem was. And Rebecca took just that little brief pause and then she said, okay. And she went ahead and ate a little more. But she wisely decided not to finish that bowl. Not that that decision did her much good, because that night Rebecca relapsed, once again collapsing in pain and vomiting. A neighbor stopped by to check on the Rose women, and once they saw what state Rebecca was in, they ran and got help. Ironically, one of the people in the little Miller's house that night was Clem Herring, the young man who thanked Ceely for the gushing love letter she wrote him, then never brought it up to her again. He did not rub it in her face or lead her on. And there was a time when Ceely stole one of his books, no doubt trying to get his attention or even just possess something that belonged to him. But Clem stayed in the house that night and helped Rebecca write out her will once the woman realized that she was not going to live long enough to see the dawn of another day. At this point, Rebecca knew that Ceely had poisoned her again, yet she still provided for Ceely in her will, asking that the family's assets be sold at auction and that any remaining sum after their debts were paid to be split evenly between her murderer and her grandson, because at this time her daughter Julia was also dead, and the only heirs she had to her name were Ceely and the little grandson that it appears Rebecca never got to see. After Rebecca's death, Ceely was taken in by a family up the road. She had wanted to stay in her own home, which people thought was odd, but by this point, they also all realized that Ceely most likely poisoned her family so that she could have a relationship with Guy. Ceely was a still cage, though. She wouldn't talk to anyone about what happened until her friend Tracy, a girl a few years younger than Ceely, came back to town and started visiting Ceely. This girl tricked Ceely, telling her that Tracy was in love with a guy that her parents did not approve of. Tracy then asked Ceely, what would she do if she were in Tracy's situation? Ceely simply replied, I'd kill them. Tracy questioned Ceely further and got the confession the prosecution had been waiting for. Ceely laughed about how she had fooled the lawmen, with all of them thinking she had poisoned the coffee when it was really the cottage cheese. She then told Tracy what poison she used, where she got it, and more importantly, where it was hidden. The autopsies on her family proved that they were poisoned, but law enforcement could not find the poison, so they had no physical proof to connect Ceely to the crime. However, Ceely revealed that she had stolen the poison from her mother, causing a huge fight between her parents when her mom accused the dad of misplacing it. After Ceely stole the poison, she emptied it into a tin can that used to house pepper and hid the pepper can beside the spring house under the leaf of a large plant. She said that she knew she could not put it in the spring house because her family or the law would find it. So she hid it outside and no one ever knew it was there. Likewise, the law did not find the remnants of the poisoned food because Ceely had thrown the remainder of the cottage cheese out into the yard. To her amusement, some of their chickens ate it, which is why several people noticed dead chickens in the Rose family's yard in the days directly after the family fell ill. Ceely also told Tracy that Guy was supposed to get her some medicine that would keep Ceely from getting pregnant. Tracy was shocked, but Ceely only wondered if Guy ever did get that medicine for her. To me, this is the most damning evidence against Guy, that maybe he was using this poor girl to get his rocks off, and him leading her on to that extent would certainly mess with her already disturbed mind. However, Guy, just like we would expect a typical guy to do, denied everything. And there's no proof that he was preying on Ceely. So all we have are her statements. She told a doctor that Guy had blown her a kiss once and that she caught his kiss and wore it on her cheek for 2 whole weeks. Ceely made a lot of other statements, like saying she didn't know why people were not allowed to kill each other. She was also trained to be highly religious and prayed daily, claiming to perfectly understand the Ten Commandments, even the one that says, Thou shalt not kill. But the most intriguing thing that she confessed to Tracy was that the reason she had been a steel trap when it came to speaking about her family was because she did not want to mess up the way Romulus Cottel did. Romulus Cottel was a farmhand who earlier that year had murdered his employers and one of their farmhands. He was caught and confessed that he had been fired from that farm because he had gotten too close to the farmer's youngest daughter. In order to be with her, he had killed her parents. The farmhand, he said, just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. When his case hit the newspapers months earlier, Ceely had overheard her parents discussing it. Then, when she was forbidden to even speak Guy's name, she remembered what Romulus Cautel had done and decided she could copy his crime, but only do it better than he did because she would not go blabbing about her crime. Ceely also knew that the poison would be sufficient to kill a person because her mother had warned her from touching the stuff, telling Ceely that just a little bit of the poison could kill a person the same way it killed those potato bugs they'd been having an infestation of. Clearly, this level of thought proves the murders were not only premeditated, but that Ceely herself did know that what she was doing was wrong, which is why she hid the evidence of her crime and then kept quiet about it. She may not have been sophisticated enough to understand the full ramifications, but she did, with malicious, cunning, and self serving intent, murder her entire family. During her trial, both the prosecution and the defense put on character witnesses. For every one who said that Ceely absolutely knew right from wrong, there was one to say that she did not. The lawyers minced words, talking about sanity in different arenas, claiming Ceely was morally and intellectually insane, but according to the prosecution, not legally insane, and therefore able to accept the punishment for her crime. The defense argued that a person who is morally, intellectually, and even legally insane does have the capacity to know right from wrong. However, because their minds are different, they are not able to avoid doing the thing they know is wrong, and therefore, legally sane or not, Ceely should not be punished. It was a very clever way to word Ceely's situation because basically the prosecution had to show that through her premeditated actions, Ceely was sane enough to know what she was doing was wrong, which they did prove that. But Ceely's overall mental development really let the defense smear those lines. They put up a good fight for her, and in the end, after only one short hour of deliberation, the jury found Ceely not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution expected this outcome, and the people of Pleasant Valley had been enraged in the weeks leading up to Ceely's arrest because they knew what Ceely did, and yet the girl was out and about in town like nothing happened. They were afraid. So, to safeguard the population, the prosecution put Ceely on trial for the death of her father, not of her mother or of her brother. The reason was to ensure Ceely would remain locked up for the rest of her life. They struck a deal for Ceely to be moved to a state mental health facility instead of going through two more trials. Guy Berry had been subpoenaed, but then the prosecution decided to spare him the humiliation. I think that if Guy was put on the stand in either of the other two murders, the defense knew they would lose, especially if Guy stuck to his story that he only spoke to Ceely to be nice and that she then badgered him nearly day and night, harassing and stalking him everywhere he went. So the deal was made, and in lieu of standing trial yet again, Ceely was moved from the jail to the Toledo State Hospital on December the 17th. There, she was supposed to stay for the rest of her life. However, Ceely was released the following year. The reason stating that she was recovered, and it appears that she went to stay with distant family that she had probably never met until the murders took place. About 18 months after she was released, word spread through Pleasant Valley that Ceely Rose had been spotted walking around free as a bird. The townsfolk lost their minds. Even though half of them had testified for the defense, the prosecutor then dropped his failsafe, and to keep from being prosecuted for the death of her mother or her brother, Ceely was returned to a state facility. This time, she was in custody until her death on March the 14th, 1934, just one day after Ceely Rose turned 61 years old. It is said that Ceely was a favorite of the employees and that none of them thought Ceely was insane, which begs the question, did the 1896 jury come to the wrong verdict? That we know of, Ceely never committed another crime. If the rumors are true, she seems to have thrived in her new environment at the state hospital. Upon her death, she was listed as a housekeeper in the state facility, though she was still buried in the part of the graveyard where they buried the bodies of the patients who had no family come to claim them. Apparently, her family had gotten together at some point and decided that they were just going to bury this story and never speak of it again. And so they just entirely and completely abandoned Ceely and pretended that she just didn't exist. There is a lot to unpack with Ceely's story, and I highly recommend that you pick up a copy of the Ceely Rose Murders at Malabar Farm. The author did tons of research, and there are many more personal stories and quotes from things that were said to doctors and things that were said at the trial that will give you more insight into Ceely's mental state. There are also pictures and some other interesting tidbits about Pleasant Valley and the people who resided there. The author even recounts a story told to him, but by a descendant of Guy Barry. This story is either true or it is a play on the part of Ceely's account where she threw the poisoned cottage cheese out into the yard so no one would find the evidence against her, and later some of the chickens died after eating the cottage cheese. But as the Barry's side of the story goes, sometime after her dad and brother were dead, but while Rebecca was still recovering and Ceely was at home being the lady of the house, Ceely had knocked on the Barry's front door and presented the family with a pie. She said she had made the pie for Mr. and Mrs. Barry, and that Guy was not to eat even a little bite of it. When she left, the Barrys threw the pie out their back door, and later, after their chickens pecked at the crust, they found the chickens dead. Again, sounds to me like it could be a play on Ceely having thrown out the cottage cheese, but one never knows. It could be true. After all, Mr. Barry is the one who got her kicked out of Guy's life, so Ceely probably did have a vendetta against him. In 1939, award-winning author Lou Bromfield purchased a large portion of the land in and around the area where the Rose family once lived. By this time, the mill had been torn down by good old Clem, who purchased the property after the Rose family had died. Somehow I think his presence in all of this and knowing he was a nice person just makes me happy. I am glad that his kindness was repaid to him in some way, because when Lou purchased the land from Clem, Lou did so by making Clem an offer that he absolutely could not refuse. Though the mill was gone, Ceely's old house still stood. Today, it's had some renovations and is rarely open to the public, but you can go there and walk around. The spring house is gone and the pond has been filled in, and there are now proper stairs going to the upper rooms. But the best part about this house is that in 2019, it was declared to be one of the nation's most haunted places. People hear footsteps and voices there, some of the sounds being the distinct giggle that has plagued the people of Pleasant Valley from the time Ceely Rose first set foot in their little town. It is said that if you take your shoes off and wait a while, Ceely will come along and tickle your feet, laughing all the while. Some claim that David and Walter are still as angry and ill-tempered as ever, and that their spirits haunt the home where they both lived and died. Others say Rebecca is still there, fiercely protecting her daughter, even in death. If you would like to go on a ghost hunt, or you are like the curious people in 1896 who came from miles around to tour the house where a triple homicide occurred, make plans to get yourself to Malabar Farm. Today, it is a state park, and the name was given to the land by Lou Bromfield, who acquired what he called his dream property. He was from Ohio and had been born 6 months after the murders, so it was the perfect parcel of land for him to buy and turn into a sustainable agricultural farm. In 1945, Bromfield's famous farm hosted the wedding of award-winning actors Humphrey Bogart and the talented Lauren Bacall. In 1956, Lou passed away. In 1973, the farm was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. And 20 full years after the Pulitzer Prize winning author's death, in 1976, Lou Bromfield's farm and the surrounding lands were turned into the Malabar Farm State Park. Go there if you have a morbid fascination and or if you like farming, history, nature, or just plain old cool stuff. I am not sure if I will get back up that way anytime soon, but if I ever do, you better believe I'll be standing outside Ceely's old house, peeping through the windows and keeping my shoes securely on my feet because giggling, ghost or not, no one is touching my feet, especially to tickle them. If you want a little more murder and madness in your life, on this month's Patreon, I'm going to cover the murder of a 2-month-old that led to her father then killing 5 people, including himself. It's another old case, but I don't want to cover the recent stuff. It's a little too raw, and there are tons of places you can go if you want current events. Over here, we're keeping it light and fun. Yep, don't worry. Next month, I'm going to do giant killer worms or star children or frogmen, just something much less diabolical. Until then, I hope you guys did enjoy this episode. If you would like to yell at me for any reason, do it on social media where I am about 99% certain not to see it. If you would like to be nice, swear an oath to never tickle another living soul. Or if you have show ideas that are fun and murdery, please send me an email at leedawnabooks@gmail.com. My website with some fantastic murder-filled thriller books is leedawnabooks.com. And you can join me on Patreon for only $2 a month or use up the 7-day free trial that I think is still being offered at patreon.com/LeeDawna. Links will be in the show note. Click them if you dare, and I will see you next month. Bye.
Immortal Monsters.